Iron Widow is a 2021 young adult fantasy sci-fi novel by Xiran Zhao. It has received more literary awards and nominations than I'm prepared to read off, so I'm just going to put them on the screen here. Have at. I've been aware of this book for a while. I didn't really bother with it because the Mecha genre of sci-fi isn't really my style. I liked Pacific Rim well enough, but that was about it. So I wasn't really particularly interested in Iron Widow because I knew it predominantly fell under that kind of sci-fi subgenre, you know, the big mecha kaiju kind of genre. Not really my thing. But then, and hey, maybe if you're familiar with my videos, you'll know where this is going. It was available on Libby, and I needed something to listen to, so I listened. I'm not going to do a super in-depth recap for this one because my main perspective on this book really doesn't require that you know the nitty-gritty details of the story. This book takes place in a futuristic timeline on Earth, ostensibly China, but takes place officially in the land of Huaxia? I think that's how they pronounced it. I'm trying to go off my memory of how they pronounced the names and whatnot in the audiobook. I listened to it, but it's been a little bit, so I might be misremembering. Some time ago, Earth was invaded by the Hundun, gigantic monsters from another planet. And so Huaxia has come up with the solution. Chrysalises, which are kind of like Pacific Rim giant mechs with the ability to change shape like the goddamn Power Rangers. And these chrysalises are controlled by a male pilot with a female concubine pilot present to provide her chi energy. Oftentimes this results in female pilots being killed. The society overall is reflective of, if I recall correctly, medieval China, except for the cities, which are high-tech and as such is rigidly divided along gendered lines. Women are terribly oppressed. Virginity is non-negotiable, and it is common for girls who are suspected of becoming romantically involved with boys outside of marriage to be drowned by their families, basically. Foot binding is a thing. For those of you who don't know what that is, foot binding was a practice in China for about 900 years, I think. Although it took about 400 or 500 years for the trend to spread out beyond the upper classes. Not everyone did it here. We need to remember that China makes up a lot of territory and ethnic groups, but a lot of them did. It was a big thing in China up until, I want to say, the 1900s. It might have gone out of style around the time the Cultural Revolution happened. I'm not sure, but it petered off and then progressively, just became a non-existent thing in China, except for the older generations of women who had it done to them when they were little kids. So basically, for a very long period of time in China, starting in the medieval era, tiny feet were a premium. So starting when a girl was a toddler, usually, her family would effectively wrap her feet in such a way that the bones would break and contort and effectively stay super small and deformed for the rest of their lives. This left women extremely limited in their mobility and in constant pain because they were literally hobbling around on bent and broken feet all the time. This is the life of our protagonist, Wu Zetian, living in the countryside with her family. She has one friend, Gao Yitzi, and a dead sister named Ru Yi, who was killed by a pilot named Yang Guan. Zetian decides to volunteer as a concubine in hopes of getting close to him and killing him to avenge her sister. After being brought to him and conveniently becoming one of his concubines, an unexpected battle has him forcing Zetian into the concubine pilot seat to be fed on and subsequently sacrificed. In the sort of shared mind space the two have together, Zetian manages to overwhelm and kill him, piloting the chrysalis successfully despite being a woman. She is subsequently taken into custody and forced to pair up with Li Shimin, a man convicted of murdering his father and brothers whose death sentence is delayed owing to his super high spirit pressure that makes him an indispensable pilot. The two end up surprisingly well matched. Like I said, not going to do a full recap of the remainder of the plot since most of it is what you might call standard big mech kaiju-esque story. Lots of battle scenes, lots of stuff inherent to the genre. Then there's the young adult side with Zetian and Shimin getting to know one another, and also Yitzi getting involved too, leading to a surprising three-way instead of a love triangle. I gotta give the author points for originality with that one. But that's the basic setup of the story. I'll leave the further specifics and ending for you to learn on your own if you choose to read the book. So let me bang through a few quick responses and critiques before I get to the main meat of my problem with this book. First, it's very young adult lit in its writing. It tells instead of shows, and there are big, straightforward info dumps about the world we're in. I'll reiterate that there's nothing wrong with a character just telling us things sometimes, but that should be a measured choice that the author makes. Telling us a few things straightforwardly in favor of allowing other facets of the plot to unfold slowly through showing is not a bad thing. It's part of the art of writing to figure out when and how to do that in a way that serves the story best. With that being said, This is extremely typical of the young adult genre, and so I can't necessarily fault this author specifically for their writing. Doing a lot of telling instead of showing is a very typical convention of this genre, probably under the idea that kids and teens need everything handed to them so that they can understand, and I can't necessarily know how much of this is the author's writing versus them being influenced by their publisher or editor. I'd have to read something they've written specifically targeted at adults to know if they're just not very developed as a writer or if this is a choice that was made because they were writing for young adult. Second, a popular criticism I've seen with this book is that Zetian is painted as a hero or that the author is validating her behavior or painting her as the good guy. I'm 50-50 on this. For reasons that I'm about to get into, the author definitely does paint Zetian as a victim, but in the author's note / trigger warning at the beginning of the book, it's explicitly mentioned that this is a destructive female rage novel. Quote, "This particular book, first in a series, is more of a depiction of destructive female rage than a nuanced feminist philosophy about how to restructure society and uplift all women, which should only be expected in later books as the characters and plot develop." Unquote. Now, I need to be transparent here. I am not a fan of female rage novels because, in my personal experience, they tend to come hand in hand with validation of bad female behavior. You know, it's like, well, she has a sob story, so I guess it's okay for her to murder that entire kindergarten full of kids. You know, that sort of thing. Or it can be an attempt to arouse sympathy for bad female behavior where there would typically be none extended. I am firmly of the belief that if you would not excuse a man doing it, you shouldn't be excusing a woman doing it. So, with that in mind, my potentially biased, or more biased than usual, read of this book suggested to me that the author was really nudging us to sympathize with Zetian and cut her more slack than would ordinarily be accorded to her. However, this is the first book in a series. The story isn't over yet. Her actions in this book could have consequences in the future. Additionally, calling this destructive female rage does put a slightly more negative connotation on this specific depiction of female rage. It seems to be hinting at those potential future consequences. So ultimately, I'm undecided. I don't like the idea that depiction equals endorsement, and it frustrates me how many people default to, well, if the main character is a bad person with sympathetic aspects, it must mean that the creator wants us to excuse and sympathize with a bad person. Or that it's always so black and white as you either sympathize with this person or you condemn them for their bad behavior. You can't have both. This is a tangent, but people make that argument with James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2 all the time, and it irritates the hell out of me because it comes across as trying to, first of all, micromanage a person's personal emotional experience with the game. It's meant to be a complex emotional experience. You spend the entire game with James before you find out what he did, and his exact motivations and remorse for it, if I recall correctly, vary depending on how you play the game and what ending you get. People can feel however they want to feel about James or Silent Hill. That doesn't mean that they or the developers are specifically validating his actions. Furthermore, just because you sympathize with a fictional character whose inner life and personality you're way more privy to than you would be in real life, doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be okay with that same behavior in the real world. My diversion into Silent Hill aside, complexity is not a bad thing. People are allowed to have opinions you don't like, and what we like in fiction does not always correlate to what we like or excuse in reality. Anyway, I have to give Iron Widow that same consideration. Zetian is allowed to be controversial and make bad decisions without the author necessarily thinking that everything she does is justified. And some readers empathizing with her experiences or thinking she's in the right in everything she does not mean that was the author's goal. In keeping with the idea of showing instead of telling, an author should not have to spoon-feed you the correct interpretation of their character, nor should they feel any need to. People are allowed to have different feelings. It's not the end of the world. With all of that out of the way, I feel compelled to move on to my main criticism of this book. My biggest problem with Iron Widow is how the themes regarding sexism and misogyny were handled. Again, I read the trigger warning and author's note at the beginning of the book, and yes, I remember that it said that Iron Widow is meant to be more female rage than feminist essay on the subjugation of women and how to improve their plight. It's not my problem. My issue is not that this book discusses sexism or misogyny, or that it depicts a society that oppresses women. That's fine. My issue is not that Zetian is angry about how women are treated in her society and feels that need to lash out over it. That's fine. My issue is that it does so constantly, insistently, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer upside my head. Okay, Let me go through it. Zetian lives on the frontier with her family. They are, by her own description, poor. Their culture is such that girls who lose their virginity before marriage are at risk of being honor killed effectively, specifically being locked into a pig cage and thrown into water to drown. Maintaining virginity is paramount. Being submissive to men and fitting neatly into the role society has designated for women is paramount. That is the culture that Zetian has grown up in. The summary on Amazon describes this as a blend of Pacific Rim and The Handmaid's Tale. I read The Handmaid's Tale a long time ago, and I have a rough memory of the lore and access to Google, which sure does help. So I know that Offred did not always live as a handmaid. She was an adult woman who lived freely and became a handmaid under duress. Any thought she had about the subjugation of women or unfair treatment can be contextualized by the fact that she has a basis of comparison. She knows what it is to have been free. She remembers life before the oppression. She remembers a culture where she had more freedom and where women in general had more freedom. What gets me about Zetian is that she is so intensely rebellious and so convinced that she's being subjected to arbitrary standards. I'm going to be using that phrase a lot because I'm quoting it directly from the book. But how does she know that exactly? What basis of comparison does she have? Who gave her the idea that it's all arbitrary sexist bullshit if all she's ever known are the people who live and believe in all of those arbitrary things? There is no mention of her being exposed to rebellious women. She's been friends with Yitzi for a while, and he let her use his tablet to research things, but there's no further explanation of Zetian maybe explaining that she's researching different cultures and seeing different ways of living, getting information about how women in other places live where they have more freedom. There's none of that. Here's the thing. There have always been rebels. There have always been women living under extremely repressive governments and social systems, and there have always been outliers among them who push back against it. But that rebellion usually comes from a place of evidence. Some women get told that they couldn't survive without a man in the house. Then they end up in a situation where they had to live without a man and realize that they could do it. Or they were aware of a woman being able to do that. Maybe someone in their community or someone in their history or someone, in their household who was able to do that. Maybe a mother, maybe an aunt, maybe a grandmother. Some women get told that they're ill-suited for certain things because women are too emotional as opposed to men being more logical. But then they prove that they're perfectly capable of restraining their emotions and maybe also witness some men being extremely emotional and irrational. And they realize that it's bullshit. If Zetian was coming at her beliefs from a place of evidence, or very simply from an attitude of women aren't treated well and I hate that, it wouldn't bug me so much. But so much of her bit is arguing that the societal standards that she and other women are being subjected to just simply aren't real. On page 10 of my e-reader, so take that with a grain of salt, we have a quote about girls using tablets. Quote, "My village elders say girls shouldn't touch these heavenly devices because we would desecrate them with, our wicked femaleness or something. Only thanks to the gods in the sky was technology like these tablets reconstructed after humanity's lost age of cowering from the Hunduns. But I don't care how indebted I am to the elders or the gods. If they don't respect me just because I'm from the wrong half of the population, I'm not respecting them back." Unquote. Okay, first, if you grew up in this society, you should probably have some awareness as to the logic the village elders are using about female wickedness. I'm not overly familiar with Chinese religious or spiritual beliefs, but Christians often justify the denigration of women by referencing it back to the biblical figure Eve. She was created from Adam's rib to be a helpmate to him, and then chooses to defy the order not to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She tempts Adam to join her in the defiance, which he does, and this leads to them being cast out of the Garden of Eden. That is the justification that many Christian sects use to relegate women to lesser positions of authority and status. The original woman was bad, so you all have to be submissive to your husbands because they know better. Though many women living in religious communities strenuously disagree with this sentiment, they do know where that attitude comes from. As I mentioned before, this novel has the usual young adult, telling instead of showing thing going on with it. Zetian has no problem looking at the audience and explaining the logic of her world. So not explaining the logic behind the sexism of her world, the greater religious and spiritual roots of where these attitudes on women come from, seems like a crucial omission. Then there's a bigger example on page 41. Quote, "We haven't spoken much since the maidenhood tests hours earlier by the aunties. One girl didn't pass. She swore in screams and cries that she never did anything with a boy, which made me doubt the accuracy of the checking system. But she was officially disqualified from becoming a concubine pilot, and then they took her away. To where, I don't know. Hopefully not back to her home. Her family would probably drown her in a pig cage. I shudder to imagine what might have happened if I somehow hadn't passed their arbitrary standards either. Unquote. Okay, so, arbitrary effectively means random or subjective. Bear that in mind. Second, obviously, this is a young adult novel, and so we're obviously not going to get a crazy amount of detail about the maidenhood test. But since she clarifies that it's given by the aunties, aka older women, I'm assuming that we're talking about a pelvic exam to determine whether or not the hymen is still intact. And yes, the hymen can be broken through non-sexual means. Strenuous physical activity can do it for some girls. But coming back to my point, how does Zetian know the test isn't reliable? Girls in this culture have good reason not to have sex before marriage. She literally just said that this girl will probably be murdered by her family for not being a virgin anymore. Logic would suggest that this girl has a big reason to lie and claim the test is wrong because her life is literally on the line. But Zetian just immediately assumes that the test has to be inaccurate because this girl, who she does not know, says she's still a virgin. And then she says, I shudder to imagine what might have happened if I had somehow not passed their arbitrary standards either. A pelvic exam, again, I have no reason to think the maidenhood test is anything but, to determine whether or not the hymen is intact is not arbitrary. It's not subjective. It's either intact or it's not. The conclusion that one has had sex because the hymen is not intact is not arbitrary either. It's just flat out incorrect. It's a misconception typical to times and places where science is not advanced enough for them to know better. Or in some modern cases, because medical science isn't considered as trustworthy as long-held beliefs and customs. But again, my overall point is, how exactly does Zetian know the test isn't accurate? If she lives in a society where girls are expected to not have sex before marriage, and all the other unmarried girls in her group pass the test, then it's not unreasonable to conclude that this one girl who failed the test may have secretly had sex. And given the society she lives in, it could be that it was non-consensual. But Zetian immediately jumps to, well, if a girl says she's a virgin, then it must be that the test is wrong, instead of suspecting that the girl could, very understandably, be lying to save her own life. That is an equal likelihood. Actually, it's even more likely since, again, this is a hyper-sexist, male-dominant society, and this girl could have been a victim of rape. Then there's another example on page 262 where she's being blackmailed by Yizi's father. So he tells her that he's going to record her reading out this contract that is being established between them. But he wants her to pose naked while doing it. That way, this becomes a very effective piece of blackmail. If she ever does something to piss him off, he can release it to the public and basically shame her publicly. So first, Zetian's eyes fill with tears, and she asks him very straightforwardly why he hates women so much. He rambles about how he doesn't hate women. Long story short, they have their roles in society, and the only ones people hate are the ones that don't listen and comply. And then there's this exchange. Quote, "It's your choice, though, of course," he adds, releasing my shoulders and backing towards his side of the table. His fingers graze the tablecloth. Bullshit. Choice? As if there's a real choice. If I refused, he would use his money and resources to discredit me and Ximin instead. He's just trying to further humiliate me, bind me with the shame of having chosen this myself. Shame. My mind catches on that word. Is this really such a shameful thing to do? He'll have a video of me. What? Naked? Wow, the horror! As if I wasn't naked when I was born. My thoughts clear. I wrestle myself out of the pit of endless shame that my family has beaten me into all my life, and the scenario suddenly becomes hilarious. This silly man is trying to shame me with my own body. Well, guess what? I have a fine body. He can get it from any angle he wants, but the video will have no real leverage over me. I don't give a single shit if he might release it to the public. Shame and humiliation are self-imposed emotions, and from here on out, I choose not to feel them. Unquote. Okay. Where has this sudden enlightenment about shame and humiliation come from? First, Zetian was raised in a society where she's in danger of being honor killed if she's not a virgin, but she gets over her fear, shame, and humiliation in the blink of an eye. So that's a bit of a convenient heel-face turn on the subject. Second, I need to stress again that she has, through nothing other than her own brilliant mind and enlightenment, come up with the most modern and empowering answer to the sexism she's being faced with. This is Zetian's entire vibe throughout the novel. It's not just, I'm angry that women are treated as disposable by society, because that's valid. It's not just, I'm angry that girls have to die in the chrysalises because that's the only way to protect us from the Hundun, because again, that's valid. It's her magically having all the right and correct takes that a modern feminist audience would want her to have on her situation, despite growing up in a radically different society. Zetian doesn't read like a character who's an organic part of her world history and culture. She reads like a modern woman accustomed to holding modern beliefs on womanhood and the sexes who's suddenly been dropped into an over-the-top patriarchal society and is now in a state of raging rebellion. She intuits that the maidenhood test is inaccurate because the author knows that determining virginity isn't so straightforward and that it's a cruel thing to judge a woman for anyway. She dismisses the village elders for their sexist attitudes about female wickedness and magically drops any shame or humiliation she might have had over being filmed naked because these are things a modern woman shouldn't, quote unquote, be tolerant or ashamed of. Zetian was a rebel from the start. No one taught her to be, she just was. Zetian is not conflicted or uncertain about her beliefs because she always knew it was all bullshit. All this current story arc does is validate her pre-existing beliefs and give them a little extra juice. That is the heart of my issue regarding the discussions of sexism and misogyny in this book. It doesn't come across as a realistic exploration of the topics from the perspective of a girl who's grown up in a society and been immersed in its norms and logic, but rather a skeptical outsider who already has all the right, according to a modern progressive audience, answers and opinions on things like virginity, female submission, and religious and spiritual conceptions of womanhood, as well as shame. And every single time the topic comes up, it is not handled with subtlety. The rest of the book was interesting enough, and again, I can't slam the author for being more straightforward and less subtle in this book when that's a typical convention of the young adult genre, but Zetian's railing against misogyny and sexism is so overblown and so mired in modern progressive language and ways of thinking that it strains my suspension of disbelief in the totality of this medieval yet technologically advanced world's terrible sexism. Because, for the final time, where is Zetian getting all of this enlightenment from? What, beyond her personal unpleasant experiences, is pushing her to view things like maidenhood tests as arbitrary? How does she know the village elders and other spiritual authorities are wrong about the spiritual differences between the sexes? How does she suddenly get over years of ingrained shame to confidently read a contract in the nude for blackmail purposes? It ebbed and flowed in intensity throughout the plot, but every time it came back, it just took me right out of it. Because one minute we're in a fantasy sci-fi novel, and the next I'm reading a feminist Tumblr post with all the subtlety of a mallet landing on my foot. So yeah, Iron Widow was sincerely not a bad concept, especially if you're into the big mech and kaiju genres. But the writing and themes surrounding sexism and misogyny were just so over the top and unrealistic for a woman who's native to the world and culture she's being oppressed by. There are other books in the series, I'm probably not going to read them, but if you have a taste for so-called female rage books, you might like this one.